Spider bites, dead parents in an alley, weird alien rings, or alien children sent crashing down from outer space in the middle of nowhere to be raised by a host couple who adopt this child as their own. Superman or Jesus, take your pick. Who doesn't love an origin story? When I was in radio, consultants warned me about being personal versus being private. They said, paraphrased, when you're at a party and someone tells a personal story, you relate to it. You're engaged in the conversation. Hey, you're like that? Me too. You're best friends. But when you cross that line into private, well, nobody wants private. Private makes people uncomfortable. When you're private, it makes your audience cringe. Like, you can both identify over not liking spicy foods, but when you delve into the specifics of why you don't like spicy foods and why, looking back, it wasn't a good idea, flush, that's way too private. Well, get ready to cringe, because I disagree with all that. Holding back is for someone else. I think we've not been private enough. It's time to feel. You know, that same consultant once told me in a critique session, you sound like the smartest guy in the room. I took that as high praise. He didn't mean it that way. And that kind of offended me. That it wasn't a compliment. I clearly had a confused look on my face. He asked me, Josh, when you're at a party and you see the smartest guy in the room, what do? Well, I was confused. What else do? You go up and try to talk to the person and hope they give you the time of day. You have someone who is clearly smart. Why wouldn't I want to sponge whatever I could from him? The consultant shook his head and, dumbed it down for me. I was on country radio. I had to dumb it down for them. What he was saying, the dog whistle, was that country people ain't too smart no good and they can't think none smart, so Duck Dynasty and Hee Haw or whatever to them so they can know when to listen for the next truck and tractor pull tickets. He said, when you see the smartest guy in the room, you don't want to stand next to him. You're going to look, like not the smartest guy in the room. And that little reminder that you're not the smartest tool in the shed, that doesn't make people feel good. Well, it didn't hit me till that moment that almost every episode of The Smurfs I watched as a kid, Brainy was launched out of the village onto his head for, being me. God, I'd become Brainy Smurf. Still, I wasn't backing down. I was heading somewhere intellectually. And I wasn't going to be dragged down by Toby Keith, Honky Tonk Badonkadonks, or county fairs. No. Rise above, folks. This is the dumbing down and numbing down of American society. In this episode, The Peril of Perspective Part 2, A New Hope, I'm giving you the origin story you didn't ask for, but I'm doing so to showcase these little traumas that make us all who we are. I'm going to give you a lot of my human mathematical equation over the next few episodes, my X factors, those horrible little truths that make me and have made me who I am and what I have been. I'm doing this all to showcase how easily we're all influenced. I want to also help show you my path out of that. Maybe you'll see some similarities. Maybe my horror story will make you feel better about your own. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see things from each other's points of view. The Peril of Perspective. And welcome to the podcast. My father passed in 2007. In one of the most fitting storylines that was ever written for a character in the history of television. Except, as much as I may break the fourth wall in real life, we aren't in a TV show, and real life storylines suck ass sometimes. The man had just about everything but cancer. Kidney failure related to diabetes and Atkins diet abuse was his last struggle. And I'm telling you, it's classic TV stuff. This guy struggled with 6 bypasses, so many health issues, heart attacks, back and foot problems, obesity, Bell's palsy, and then on his way to dialysis, an appointment he changed so that another patient could visit with her out-of-town family a little longer. He pulls out of a gas station and was T-boned, taken away from his family permanently. Airlifted to University Medical Center, he would slip into a coma the following day. He would wake up once, but ultimately 3 weeks after that accident, we lost him. Suddenly, out of the blue, my father was taken from me. I was given a very difficult 3 weeks to cope with and accept that he was gone. Well, at the conclusion of that 3 weeks, I had to kill my father. In some warped-ass prophecy come true, the only son of the oldest of 7 took his father's light from this world with a swift thrust of a mighty... All joking aside, I had to make the call to turn the machines off. Not that dramatic. I had to say goodbye to my best friend. I had to say goodbye to the person who knew me best in this world. I had to say goodbye to the anchor for most of my life. I was left with a narcissist, abusive marriage, a narcissistic, abusive working environment. I was sexually harassed every day at work while being denied intimacy or having it used as some bargaining chip at home. Depression doesn't even really begin to describe that downward spiral. Again, I have a whole episode about this coming up where I discuss corporate culture and mental health. One day, amidst all of that, I had my best friend, though complicated relationship, but the next day he's laying in a hospital bed, barely conscious. And then I had to decide when it was time to give up hope. Spoilers. I still had hope when I pulled the plug. I wasn't convinced the old man could die, if I'm being honest. And part of me, for rather solid evidence, isn't sure he did. It's another episode. But I want to say that about my dad, I want the disclaimer out there before I go any further that my father was a good dad to me in most ways. The best ways he could, I guess. A complicated individual, that's for damn sure, but I have no desire to sully my father's name. He was far from perfect, but he showed me a kind of unconditional love and sacrifice by my perspective for a very large portion of my life that probably kept me from turning full-on sociopath, if I'm being candid. Nothing I say at this point in my life changes the fact that he sacrificed every goal and dream he had to lug me around and try to make my life better, to get me to a point where I can even do this podcast. That's thanks to my father. Regardless of the fact that the places he did lug me around to were toxic, racist, and not very progressive in nature, he did what he knew to do. When he got scared, he did what we all do. We cling to familiar. Sucked for me, but I think that was the best he could muster at the time. I think Daddy was the kind of person who always thought he was better than Rockwood, Tennessee, but whenever he left Rockwood, Tennessee, his life just didn't seem to work out. So eventually, he returned to Rockwood, Tennessee, where he had spent pretty much the rest of his life. He was content. A contentment with mediocrity that I didn't recognize early on in my dad. That settling came later. It was his drive, I remember, as a young man. He was driven later, maybe more so as a private business owner, but Daddy's big dreams kind of just died in Rockwood, Tennessee. Look, I'm not knocking small-town life entirely. I'm saying that my dad, once upon a time, wanted to be the king of whatever the heck it was he did. Not just the best heating and air guy in Roane County, Tennessee. Bigger, better. But then somewhere, Daddy's spirit got crushed. He turned to church, sure, once he got back home. Church away from Rockwood, Tennessee, that was hit and miss. I remember we were really into it when I was a little kid, but after the divorce, fight or flight, survival mode. And here I am, however young the casting director thinks I look. And I'm just now really embracing my dreams, my bigger dreams. I know firsthand being a dad to my daughter and stepdaughters and knowing what sacrifices it takes to be there for them. I see my own dad through a much different light in that regard. Peril of Perspective. The way he was able to take on and love someone else's children, my older brother and sister. He loved them as his own. Right? How he could do that or even come close or even tolerate somebody else's kid. You know what I mean? It's perspective. See, my dad was my best friend and closest confidant for most of my life. And I miss him so much sometimes, but also I've done the mental work to realize that I hold on to a lot of toxic ideals and attitudes my father bestowed upon me. I don't think he knew it. It was just him being him and sort of commonplace in a different time. But Dad and I were close. So what he thought in emulating him or making Daddy proud, that was always important to me. That is a huge staple in my culture. I was ready to lose my dad at 14 when I had to drive him to the ER for his first heart attack. Dad wasn't a healthy fella. He rode hard and put up wet, as he used to describe women. So I was prepared to lose my father. I didn't have a choice. I grew up kind of knowing I might find him dead one day and be, what then? I wasn't ready to lose my best friend. And going through that with the ultimate decision on his fate in my lone hands because I wouldn't allow anyone else in to help lighten that burden because, trauma. But also that I didn't want to cause anyone the trauma of having to feel the burden of making that choice, to take someone's life. Because I believe it is that serious, even in that situation. I took a man's life, and that weighs heavily on me. I've dealt with this in therapy, and I've come to all the human terms I can with it, but due to my own private and deeply personal spirituality, the taking of a life, but especially, I'm sure, a human life, your father's, at least psychologically, is one of the greatest acts with spiritual consequences one can perform. In mercy, one must be entirely pragmatic. In execution, in judgment, I'm just not sure there is a path of recovery from that. Accidental? I think it comes down to circumstances and your own personal responsibility, even that which we gaslight ourselves out of acknowledging. Only you know where your heart, intent, and responsibility rest, and that's probably how some of that is supposed to be. Self-harm, even putting yourself in dangerous situations like I've discussed before. These are all heavy things to consider, and we don't often delve that deeply into it, because to do that means we must humanize the killer a little more. We must accept some things about human psychology that are pretty scary. Yes, I even overthought everything about pulling the plug on my dad. This sounds like I'm unloading a lot of stuff that should be reserved for therapy, I know. The reason I'm doing this, though, is that I've already done that. This is the benefit of having worked through a lot of that. I get to set aside my feelings on the matter and examine the events from different perspectives. My perspective is, well, my dad is dead and he isn't here to defend himself against anything I might say, assumptions I might make, or conclusions I might come to at this stage of my life. And I'm very conscious of that fact, that many of the people in my life responsible for who I was and am are gone, and I can't confront them about things the way I've been able to with others. For example, my mom. My mother's a good woman. She's probably given me life more times than just birth. My mother was there for me when I needed a mom the most. Now, that moment just came when I was an adult, dealing with the loss of a marriage and family. And I would have loved to have been closer to my mom as a kid, but my mother and I weren't close after the divorce. I blamed her and resented her for a long time, longer than I'd like to admit now. I hated her. And I realize now that while my dad didn't really go out of his way to infect me with toxicity about my mother, the way my mom did back then towards my dad, it was my loyalty to my father, and I think picking up on even his subtleties that he tried to hide played into some of that. I wouldn't have given my mother the chance to explain herself because then I would betray my dad. My brother and sister kind of sided with my mom. I would come to find out later for valid reasons. I went back to dad. I was his biological child, and I've discussed some of that before. But my mother became the MacGuffin, the big plot point that propels the character story, but you never really see much of it in the movie. My mother sort of became the scapegoat, a shoulder bearer for all my struggles and failures, because by one perspective, my mom left. And if my mommy didn't even love me, who could? What kind of shit show horror shop of mental fuckery is that? My mother loved me tremendously. Life happened to her, and her marriage ended, and my dad's marriage ended, just like my first marriage ended, and just like my first marriage, I think they were just two people married to each other, but in two different marriages. If that makes sense. I can relate to that for sure. I walked around for years allowing her response to her trauma to impact my response to my trauma. And it was just unproductive and toxic. My mom was and is a good woman. She's the epitome of Southern grace. We had our struggles, but our relationship today should be an inspiration for anyone. She's among one of my closest confidants. My parents, I believe in my heart, did the absolute best they could. However, their choices, decisions, and reactions often hurt me and disrupted my life. And I have two choices with that fact. I can be angry and upset with people who were damaged by their own traumas in their own lives, just like me, and hold on to that negativity and resentment throughout my life, allowing it to disrupt and infect every facet of my life and relationships thereafter. Or I can process it, deal with it, confront it, accept it, and analyze it so that I stop making the same generational mistakes. Today, I choose the latter. It's far more interesting and more beneficial for my daughters, my marriage, and well, all of you. This is really the story, broken down, of the first half of my life and the back half of my life. I spent far too long being angry. Imagine if that's one of your sheets of cellophane I discussed in my previous episode. If that's one of the filters through which you see the entire world, and you never learn to peel that back. Like so many of you, I come from a broken, shattered family. Dead dad. My brother's dead too. Suicide at 28. My sister's well and happily married. She's a very private person, so I don't really talk a lot about her, except to say that, for the purpose of this topic, we had a similar path as my mother and I had. We didn't talk for about a dozen years. And if I'm being fair, that was my doing. Because of improperly processed trauma and very poor training in the social sciences like psychology and even sociology, my minor, I lost valuable time and memories with members of my family. Because of a twisted sense of patriarchal loyalty and a fear of not belonging if I turned on the only person I kind of somewhat belonged with, I not only refused to accept claims of inappropriate behavior, I flat out denied to even hear it. I'm sure I fell into victim blaming back then on some level. I'm certain I could have done more to listen better. But let me say this, please, because I know this is going to rattle some cages and can't begin to explain in even one episode how this warped patriarchal loyalism is very much a foundation of toxic white Southern culture. It was easy not to hear what I didn't want to acknowledge. There was no one really to speak up for victims and stuff like that, even accusations or even a, hey, don't look at me like that, please. It wasn't, you just wouldn't have said that in most cases, especially in some situations. Now, I knew, even if he was just inappropriate because of the times and didn't know acceptable boundaries, or whether he had some really problematic shit going on in his head, I knew. And I think we all knew. When we know. That's hard. Because I'd go on to leave my dad alone with my daughters after we found out that my ex's father was a child molester. Oh, that revelation 6 months into our marriage? And maybe that story is a little too private, not for me, but for others involved. So while some of that isn't my story to tell, I'm certain I will tell the part that is. Because that part was traumatic, and it plays just as much a part into this deconstruction as anything else. Told you. I'm a piece of shit. I wasn't a good brother, son, uncle, nephew. And there was no reason for it other than I was hurt and unable to process trauma. We all were. My brother's suicide sent a wake rippling through our family with innumerable ramifications. That's what suicide does. That's what trauma does. He could have died in a car accident any number of ways, and the outcome have been slightly different. Suicide? It's in its own unique way. I can't pretend I'm completely over it. That's not possible. The thing with suicide, the dirty little secret that nobody shares, is that even if they leave a note, even if their last words are telling you why they're doing it, you'll never know why they did it. You'll never comprehend what they had to endure to go and make that decision. Because I can tell you, I've sat there with my finger on the trigger and I know how close I was and how far away I was from it at the same time. I was suicidal for most of my young life. My song, I Killed Myself, under my Sir Talks-A-Lot moniker, chronicles my many failed attempts to leave this realm I never felt I belonged in. Still, I can't even comprehend. This is an area I'm not sure I will ever understand. And I'm thankful that part of me died years ago. I killed myself for the last time in 2009. Today, I'm not that man, and it's liberating. But I also know that like addiction and recovery of cancer and remission, it's always looming, and I have to do the work to stave it off, to make sure I'm the best mental me I can be every day. Therapy helps. Trauma manifests in many ways, and I believe that therapy, or any pursuit of self-awareness, begins and ends with trauma. The trauma occurs, whatever it may be, and then for years you're affected by it until you realize it, and then hopefully you begin chasing down the origins. Because trauma to the emotional psyche is devastating and destructive. It's a cancer eating away at the good. It's growing and spreading the negativity throughout. In fact, I'll argue that undealt with trauma is the source of just about every single negative aspect of each one of our personalities. Therapy is essential. So let's discuss trauma more for just a moment. Boy, I've discussed some of mine, haven't I? I bet you got plenty yourself, if you allow yourself to think about it, to feel. Merriam-Webster defines trauma as an injury, such as a wound to living tissue, caused by an extrinsic agent. An extrinsic agent just means something external or outside of our bodies. But it also offers a mental health definition as well. Trauma as a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury. The American Psychological Association goes just a little further. The APA defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, sexual assault, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. Remember in the previous episode, I discussed how scars come physically from trauma, and that our minds and spirits and psyche and soul can also be scarred. Well, talk about scars. In 2000, I injured my right knee. I was waiting tables, carrying buckets of ice for a drink station. I slipped on a wet floor. My right knee buckled. My anterior cruciate ligament was snapped. I was rushed into the manager's office, made to sign a bunch of papers I didn't get to read and understand, and then I was rushed to a clinic. I had one surgery and it was miserable. Apparently no one bothered to look on my chart and see that I was allergic to a certain medicine. It was traumatic. Coupled with, just as I was feeling like I was getting my stability and strength back, the wackadoo surgeon decided that charging workers' comp once wasn't enough for his boat down payment. He wanted to go in a second time, since, someone else was paying for it. He said he felt my knee give a little when he tugged on it. I tell you, I was walking and fine. I felt amazing. I had incredible lateral stability. Regardless, that whole experience, as well as the physical rehabilitation to recover from that second surgery, was overwhelming and torturous. Traumatic. How did it affect me? Innumerable ways. Nightmares, flashbacks, just like the definition. I still get physically thinking about that medicine I was allergic to and how after every step I took since, it has been in fear that this knee or the other might give out. What does that cost me? Type 2 diabetes and about 40 extra pounds, if I'm being honest. countless film and television opportunities in our vain yet evolving media. I stopped working out. I was afraid to run, jump, not to mention a distrust of surgeons and medical professionals altogether. I felt like I'd been used as a pawn to make more profit. This distrust almost caused me to ignore a life-saving procedure years later. I could keep going. But here's the thing. After that traumatic injury, I was assigned physical therapy to learn how to cope with my healing limb, to strengthen it and get my body back into shape after surgery. I was not prescribed mental therapy, and this is where our medical system fails us. They should go hand in hand, because what we know of trauma, it isn't exclusive. Physical and mental go hand in hand. I know that listening to someone tell their own story can be taxing, but I have many other examples. They're just not mine to share. For me, without someone here telling their story, me telling it is a violation. But generally speaking, I've seen people crushed by bankruptcy, getting laid off, fired, or even just written up for something at work. They internalize this perceived failure without any understanding or objectivity. They beat themselves up and allow that negative shadow voice to take over, the one in your head that tells you you're not good enough. I've seen it. Crippled by this overwhelming sense of failure, they settle in life or continue down that path of poor choices. Imagine what therapy could have done. A structured, focused analysis on the circumstances and what led up to them. I've known sexual abuse survivors who didn't get the help they needed. People who woke up one day finding out their entire life was a lie, that someone they loved and cared about was a pedophile, a monster, and that so many people in their sphere were victims. No therapy. And guess what? Surprised that the results are unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, anxiety, and depression. Erratic behavior. All because we think we're strong enough to deal with things ourselves. Things no human could or should be able to process alone. That's putting a lot of unfair weight on our shoulders. Why do we do this to ourselves? I've been around people who have been in abusive relationships and haven't addressed these things in therapy. And that undealt with trauma ripples outward from that person and impacts their relationships after. Just like I said before with my own mom and dad. Now, I can be resentful and harbor those negative emotions and let it infect everything I touch. Or I can embrace it, deal with it, accept it, and go to therapy. I've talked about my parents' divorce and my mom leaving and how that impacted me. I've talked a little about losing my father and brother. These events traumatized me deeply, leaving scars I'll be aware of until the day I die. Because that's what trauma does. It scars or destroys. I avoid the interstate exit to this day, the one where my dad's accident took place. Yeah, I can get to the same place at the next exit. It's fine. To this very day, seeing somebody put their fingers to their head in a symbolic and sarcastic gesture of being over it can still send me over the edge to a very sensitive place, even though I do this at least once a week myself. I'm a snowflake, I guess. I guess losing my brother to a gun-assisted suicide makes me weak when I turn my head when a movie or a TV show depicts that act. I guess I'm a pansy because it impacts the way I view gun issues. Because my parents split up and I was left to assume why, I somehow or another directed my disappointment and distrust into feelings of inadequacy and rejection at the most foundational levels. My parents. They didn't love me, so they split up. I wasn't good enough, so they couldn't stay together. And this anger and resentment toward my mother manifested into some misogynistic disregard for women's feelings. No, I wasn't a punch a hole in a wall kind of traumatized, though believe me, anger issues were a part of my personal struggle. Pretty sure that comes with taking a belt buckle to the back of the cranium trying to run away from a whipping. I'm serious, my dad was like Indiana Jones with a belt. While I don't believe I was violent or abusive, I was the emotionally disconnected, sort of reckless with other people's emotions kind of traumatized. I'll touch on that more in a few minutes, but Spoilers, I don't think that makes me a snowflake. Whatever it makes me, I think it rhymes with moosh bag. I was a different kid. I look back on strong male role models outside of my dad and my brother, and they just weren't really there. And those two, not the models of chivalry. Chauvinism, yeah. I looked up to pastors and sometimes church leaders, but with a few of the church leaders I grew up with, well, let's just say, well, the impression tipped a little negative sometimes. I didn't really grow up with grandfathers except on television. My grandmothers were two of the most loving and wonderful women I could have asked for, but single for most of my childhood. I lost both of them years apart. Losing my Nana, my mom's mom, that was tough. It was tough. Without specifics, when she passed, I didn't cry. I was there. My mom was out of state flying back home. My dad had to leave the room because he couldn't handle it, probably trauma linked to his own father's death. My uncle, who lived with and took care of my Nana, my dear sweet Nana, he needed support at that moment. In the moments following her final breaths, I had to be strong for him. And once he regained composure, it seemed like the moment had passed. Like, okay, my turn, wah wah. Like after that, the shock set in. And I'm here to tell you, I didn't shed a tear of sadness that wasn't by choice for years after that. I know how that sounds. But I remember thinking, no, if I didn't cry over Nana, I'm sure as hell not crying over this. And one side could say it made me incredibly stronger, built up this pain threshold, this tolerance for enduring emotional trauma, but it didn't help me process it. It just helped me hold it in and mask it, eating away at me for years. My Nana's death was traumatic for me. She was my first significant family member to die. Not just losing her, seeing my dad cry, which was odd since this was his ex-wife's mother. Me holding my uncle as he sobbed. Revelations, that side of my family that I'd been ignorant to started to come out. Not anything bad or anything, but sometimes like feeling like stuff's been kept from you, even if it's pointless, can traumatize your trust. I didn't cry, not over girlfriends. Well, I think I cried when I found out I had to have the second ACL repair on my knee. I remember I broke down there because the first one was miserable for me. But for years, I didn't cry. Losing my granny was another story altogether. But losing her the way I did in the place I was at in life when it happened, with everything else going on then, it traumatized me. Watching her die, it wasn't peaceful. I basically had to abduct her from the assisted living facility she was at so I could take her home to die. And then a month later, I was in a car accident that nearly killed or paralyzed me. A month later, I was rushed into surgery on my spinal cord with significant cord compression, which left me with a whole bunch of really fun side effects. It also left me standing on the precipice of another forced career change. I just retired from radio a couple of years earlier. I had to move back home to Tennessee and fight for my parental rights. Now I find out I may never walk again. And I certainly can't work in the car business anymore physically. I did, but not for long. I'll admit part of working for myself is necessity. But I rushed myself back to work after that trauma because of foolish ideals someone else planted in my head. Ideals of duty, responsibility, working hard for promotions, loyalty, and just those things Dad always taught me were important. More important than my health. You got to sacrifice to get ahead. Trauma. You see? I needed to take longer to recover. Instead, I rushed back because I was worried about a promotion, my position, a job. I liked most of these people, don't get me wrong, but I should have never even gone back to work there at all. It was one of the most reckless decisions I made. And for what? A job I don't have today, skills I no longer use, clients who don't follow me now, and then on to my next thing, and people I barely see or talk to anymore. I'm not knocking them. Life happens, and I'm a shitty friend too. It's just to say that ultimately my decision to go back to work did me way more harm than any good it would have caused me or the company. And I only did so out of some weird sense of obligation and fears that were instilled upon me, and none of those things mattered compared to my health. Or at all in the end. And let me be clear, for all my knocks against capitalism, corporatism, retail sales, or any of the places I worked, this job that I'm talking about, my job at that time was not the problem. Come back on my terms, they said, when I was ready. Work half days if you need to. They were seriously very good in that regard, with my position still waiting on me. And I know for a fact people were talking about me behind my back during that time, criticizing and making comments about preferential treatment because of my schedule. I heard it. So I know my managers did too. And they still allowed me to come back on my terms. They welcomed me back with open arms. So, with all my experience in the workforce, that's pretty significant, something worth mentioning. This decision, this warped sense of obligation is on me and the ideals with which I was raised that somehow superseded common sense and medical advice. This indoctrination of the wrong kind of work ethic, some 1950s level commie red scare shit, traumatized me. That's what I'm saying. Trauma isn't just a catastrophic event. Trauma can result in even the most minuscule details, and it can impact you as you go out through your life. How could I have addressed this in therapy? I was depressed. Anxiety. So many things after that surgery. I almost died. I had to face a reality where I may never walk again or walk without a cane. Or at very least, I would be confined to that cane or more limited liability or mobility for most of my life. I had to call my ex-wife, for crying out loud, and beg her to let me have a few hours the evening before my surgery just to say goodbye to my daughter and hold her for what I thought might just be the last time. We didn't know what would happen when those discs came out of my spine. I desperately needed therapy. I just didn't know it. Just from the accident, injury, surgery, recovery, I'm not sure I ever really even processed losing my grandmother 2 months prior. I just didn't have the luxury. I know this whole thing is just all about me. But it isn't. It's about us. It's about you because you've lost someone. You've been impacted by someone you lost too soon. A custody battle, divorce, trauma, toxicity, changing careers, job drama, health events. This isn't my story. This is our story. Yours probably varies a little bit in the details, but this is what we are about. Trauma. I talk about my own because it's what I got. Plus, to illustrate to you that these events that we often shrug off as life happening need to be addressed. These are significant traumatic events that can destroy even the strongest human beings. We're ill-equipped for the devastation that emotional and mental trauma can unleash. Have you ever heard someone say something like, well, according to science, we only use about 10% of our brain power? Research that and get back to me on it. Let's just assume it's right or close. If we only use 10% of our brain power, how much of that 10% is impacted by the 100% traumatic lives we lead? Remember what I said in previous episodes? The human mathematical equation? Cops? Well, all of this, these are my X factors. This is my human mathematical equation. Remember the part about life beginning and ending with trauma? Well, here's a quick recap. Childbirth is traumatic. We go from the warmth and isolation of the womb to lights, camera, and action of a delivery room, with all the bells, beeps, and smells of a hospital and constant human interaction. It's sensory overload. From the first breath of life. And then death, even if you can't see it physically, inside the mind, it must be traumatic, right? Look, as magnificent as life is, life ceasing must be unimaginable. Traumatized people living traumatized lives, traumatizing other traumatic people. That's all we are. I need you to understand that it's okay. You're allowed to be traumatized. It's okay to still not be okay. It's okay to still not be over your ex, even if you've both moved on. But it's okay to still be hurt about your parents' divorce, no matter how old you are. It's okay to feel. Allow yourself to feel and heal. Therapy. Feeling and healing. If it's easy, everybody'd do it. The human mathematical equation dealt with how we react to the stressors and traumatic events around us. This and the previous episode are more about personal responsibility and owning our own behaviors. The peril of perspective, my friends, is that you're no longer blind to the struggles or feelings of others. Once you open yourself up to another's point of view, yours must also change. And previously on Overthinking Everything, we know a good method for dealing with this stuff is cups: compassion, understanding, perspective, and support. In that cups episode, I told you how to apply that to others. Well, this episode is really about applying that to yourself. Allow a compassionate response. We've all done something we aren't proud of. We've all told a joke we regret or something like that. At very least, we remained silent while that joke or whatever was told. We need to be able to react right now with compassion for ourselves, forgive ourselves for our previous selves. We can be angry at the institution that bred the atmosphere that made the joke commonplace. But I'm just not sure how many of us could withstand cancel culture coming after us. I couldn't. I know I couldn't. I've said and done some terrible things, mostly in the name of getting a laugh. Ugh. In the cancel culture or cancer culture episode, I explored a little deeper into the cultism that plays into the either-or pick-a-side mentality we discussed in Pen Pals, and how that plays into our theme of why we are the way we are. Why these conspiracy theory wackadoos fall prey to this cultism. But when looking at our own behaviors, it's important to do so with that cups method. If you can't forgive yourself, how do you expect anyone else to? The easy response is to hear something horrific I said and condemn me. I offer no excuses. I said terrible things on stage, in private, locker room talk, racist jokes, pedophilia jokes, the worst of the worst, even mocking disabled people. Nothing was off limits. Everything was fair game in the name of funny. And to a large degree, that is how I perceive comedy. Funny doesn't know right from wrong. Funny just is. We must allow for some extremism, even if it's offensive, because comedy, laughter, can often be the starting point for otherwise awkward discussions. And I'm someone who has always tried to find the humor even in the darkness. It's how I cope. Part of my trauma response. Now, when I say I did stand up, understand that I mean that as very literal as it sounds. I did a handful of venues, some before I was even legally allowed to get in, and most of them were amateurish open mic night things. I never opened for anyone, toured, or lived that lifestyle. The few actual gigs were spent around actual career comics, no names, just guys who traveled and told jokes. Whomever they were, living out of hotels, smoking, drinking, drugs, depression, and divorce. Nothing at all I felt like I wanted my life to be about. I worked out some shitty material here and there. I did some shows. I can say I did stand up, but I quit. I had unbelievable performance anxiety back then. I couldn't go on stage sober. Not quite stage fright. I could go on, but everything before going on stage was miserable. I was acting back in college, but when my brother died, it rattled me to the core, and I was afraid of tapping into my emotions on stage to act again. I almost lost it in front of an audience. I no longer felt safe on stage. I was traumatized. I stopped performing everything for a while, except on the radio, hidden behind the safety, security, and anonymity of a microphone. In a play months before my brother's suicide, I had to deliver a monologue with pantomime actions behind me on stage. Other actors, and one of which depicted my character's brother dropping to his knees, putting a revolver to his temple and pulling the trigger. My monologue was sort of the emotional crux, the climax, if you will. My character was silent throughout most of the show, brooding and pacing in the background. The funny thing is, for one reason or another, we never made it through the full rehearsal start to finish, not even dress rehearsal. So opening night was technically our first run-through all the way. And my mind was everywhere opening night because I was focused on the lines and the Italian accent and being the character. So having never made it through the entire speech on stage before opening night wasn't optimal. And the place my mind went to in order to tap into that emotion for that scene was seeing my actual brother take his own life. Seeing that happen in my own head. Then 7 months later, he would, just as I saw it months before. He didn't know. He never saw the play. I'm not sure anybody knew at the time. But I knew. Trauma. I walked away from my dream because of trauma. I bailed on my after-college plans of pursuing, performing, and moving to LA. I'm not saying I was good enough or am good enough to make it. I'll never know. Because I allowed unresolved trauma to dictate my life. I don't want to say I settled for radio. Radio gave me a really fun career and life while it lasted. But to a large degree, I settled on my dreams. I went with my backup plan. I recoiled in every imaginable way. I even settled in radio because I never wanted to do country radio. I wanted to make a name for myself in alternative rock. But there I was, one of the hottest young program directors in the industry for a while. Successful, sort of. Traumatized, in a metaphorical fetal position. Scared of my own success. After my brother died, I went back to college, and my give-a-damn was broken and the parts were on backorder. I started openly using drugs, mostly cannabis, but I was no longer interested in hiding it like I was before. I would routinely show up drunk or high. I began, without indicting myself, profitably sharing my resources. I experimented with... No, I mastered psychedelics. This is a hard thing for me to talk about publicly for a lot of reasons. Yeah, my kids are going to see this, but I need to. We need to. Plus, they don't get to do drugs. I did all of theirs. Enough for a few generations. I'm ashamed and embarrassed by some of my behavior, but I'm trying like hell to understand it. I'm also learning how to accept and own the behaviors and aspects of me that are who I am. Those I didn't always like because other people were too afraid of me. They wouldn't let me shine. I've learned to love myself, despite everything. My brother took his life in the June of '99. The following New Year's Day, I would accidentally overdose. Purely accidental, I swear. I had a massive sinus infection and just needed the pain and the swelling to cease. I didn't know I had a sinus infection until my best friend found me half naked on my front lawn of the apartment complex, barely breathing, and somehow summoned Wonder Woman's strength to load me into her Ford Probe and take me to the ER. You know, from a different perspective, me, half-conscious on the front lawn in the freezing cold, found by a small being with incredible abilities and being taken into a probe to be poked and prodded and tested under cold, bright lights. Boy, without that when I was in college part of the story, that could be an alien abduction memory. I was in college and I just had a headache that felt like an alien busting out of my noggin, and no insurance. So I kept taking whatever I had with little regard for the consequences, literally numbing my pain. Remember that part if you're taking notes? It comes up again. However, per the aforementioned independent pharmaceutical distributorship, I had access to more than I needed. But my depression and failure to properly deal with the trauma of my brother's death combined with, for the first time in my life, feeling this mentally ill, warped loss of hope and control that suicide was no longer an option for me. Seeing how my brother's suicide impacted everyone and knowing I could no longer do that, knowing the negative energy I would cast out into the universe. I think it's one thing to kind of know that people are going to be sad or devastated by your actions, but when you see and you feel those actions play out before you, well, it certainly bred a self-destructive ambivalence within me that probably led me to where I didn't care if I lived or died, and would have probably been okay if I did die. I couldn't do it, not after my brother stole my thunder, but I sure as hell wasn't going to jump out of the way of the car if it went off the road and onto the sidewalk, is what I'm saying. That's tough, because that's also suicidal behavior. Even when I didn't feel suicidal or like I could take my own life, my actions were flagrantly dismissive of consequence. All resulting from beat the dead horse just a little more. Trauma. Look, I was always tormented by something, but not really equipped with the tools to handle it. Robbie, my brother, I felt responsible and simultaneously blamed others. Now, how messed up is that? But he didn't have the tools either, and it cost cost us his life. I know people in therapy who make poor choices. I certainly continue to do so. I've known people in therapy who have taken their own lives. I'm not saying therapy is the panacea, but it's a valuable tool that you're better off having in your arsenal when a battle comes looking for you. Just another arrow in the quiver, so to speak. Remember a few minutes ago, I was talking about my brother and I said, for the first time, suicide was off the table for me? I talked about my song. Here's a harsh reality. My first suicide attempt was 12 years old. It's hard to remember, to be honest. There were a lot. I used to joke that the only reason I'm alive is that I'm better at murder than suicide. See, I wasn't funny at all, but it made for a nice hook to a song I made called I Killed Myself, inspired partially by this episode, if I can be honest. I'll play that for you at the end of the episode. Trigger warning. Language. For me, in my traumatized, depressive, angst-ridden self, I always held suicide as God's grand escape clause. Until it happened to me, to my brother. Part of that was just me being me and saying outlandish things to get attention or make people think, but I honestly believed it. And I'm not sure chicken and egg which came first. Did my attitude about suicide create the joke, or did I tell the joke so much I ended up believing it, numbed to the agony of the reality of suicide? When life got too hard, I had a way out, and that was some macabre comfort for me for so long. Now imagine that. Suicide, the notion of taking my own life, ending my existence, was comforting to me. What kind of trauma is that? That's unhealthy on every level. When Rob died, once the dust settled, I began to sort of anonymously volunteering where I could for suicide prevention causes. I dove in privately. I didn't share it with many people because it was deeply private. It was a process I had to go through. I didn't want to share the info, the pain, or the experience. I needed it to be my thing, my burden. I couldn't save him. It was my fault. And that was how I needed to deal with that trauma. Improperly, mind you. And for me, volunteering, sitting on a hotline or reaching out to others who were struggling, it didn't mesh with the masculinity that I was brought up with, trauma. How I felt about masculinity, trauma. Sounds overly sensitive, but dig deep, y'all. You'll find your own little traumas there. Pull up your bootstraps, dig in, work hard, and we'll get over it. It isn't the trauma that defines us. It's how we deal with the trauma. You know, like me burying my brother in a glow-in-the-dark Yoda t-shirt. But that's another story. We've discussed, especially in the last few episodes, the death of a loved one, problems in school, family strife, job stress, even indoctrination and exposure to cultism. All of this can cause trauma as well as traumatic responses. Now, let's hit things just a little deeper. Trauma, as I've laid out, could stem from any number of things. When we're properly equipped with the tools to process and deal with it, well, it won't be perfect. My knee took nearly a year to rehabilitate. It was painful and miserable. However, as large as the scar going down my right knee is, mine can walk. It's stable. Still hurts. It's my built-in barometer. I can always tell when it's going to rain. But dealing with and processing trauma, it's essential to living a fulfilled life. The pain of losing a family member, that's a longer, more constant process. But I assure you, it's better dealing with it in therapy. Dealing with it in therapy makes it easier for you dealing with it outside of therapy. And imagine if we knew, just like with a knee injury, you're looking at 6 to 9 months of average recovery time, depending on the injury, your physical shape, etc. What if we have a similar diagnosis for emotional trauma? If we had research-driven parameters to go by? I wonder if it would encourage us to heal and deal with our issues. I'm so sorry you just lost your father, Josh. It's going to be about 3 to 5 years before you really settle into life, not expecting him to be there. But within a year to 18 months, you should be over most of the grief. Emotional trauma isn't that simple. Or is it? Coming up, I'm breaking down some of the core cultism that defines who we are, why we're so defensive and offensive, and to be fair, even a little special teams sometimes. We're quick to stereotype and judge others, and some of the cultural contributions to these toxic ideals might surprise you. How does sports play into our jumping to conclusions? How are sports to blame for the numbing down and dumbing down of society? I'm talking about competition culture, sports cultism, where exactly our loyalties lie, and how one major sports icon may just be to blame for the turning point of our current social division. In fact, one athletic organization in particular may have planted the seeds of the treasonous Republican insurrection and attempted assassination of America's elected officials. In the next episode, I'm breaking down the New World Order of ethical ambiguity, how our principles of integrity, honor, loyalty, ethics, patriotism, and even spirituality have become so intertwined with toxic sports culture. It's no wonder the lines of nationalism get blurred for decades, giving way for a rise of American fascism. It's all about winning, 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 and making sure nobody else wins anything. We're not going to be losers. It's all there in Umberto Eco and Lawrence Britt's 14 Characters of Fascism list. Google it. Let's just say I'm overthinking sports and competitiveness and how far we're all willing to go to win. How far we're willing to tolerate others going so that they can win. A good hard look at one of the foundations of toxic white Southern culture. Sports, competition, and compromising your values, all for the love of the game. As I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, and, well, clips of my acting and voiceover work, and it's all organized in playlists for you. So check out that, my merch store, and get all your Sir Talks a Lot swag. Follow me on TikTok, like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and, well, do all the things I need you to do. If you like the series, consider a donation to Cash App or subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.